Thank you. We're here today with Daniel Brunstetter, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and the Director of Study Abroad there. Daniel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Can you tell us what got you interested in the just war tradition originally, and also what you're working on currently?
I've been thinking about this, and I can't point to a specific moment. In fact, it goes back to a series of individual malaises, if you will, over time in my experiences with war, my intellectual attempt to grapple with them. I remember the first time I thought about war was when I was a young boy growing up, and there was a civil war going on in Lebanon, and my father was in the Air Force, and I remember someone had gotten kidnapped, and I remember tying yellow ribbons around trees and, in a sign of solidarity for the kidnapped people, and sort of always hearing about Lebanon as the place of conflict and civil war. And it's a funny story. I remember I had to have organ lessons in a town in Illinois called Lebanon, and I was terrified that I was going to get shot, and I didn't know why I had to go to Lebanon to have these terrible organ lessons. I didn't have a good sense of geography back then, but I remember that sense of fear of Lebanese sticking with me until one day, much later, I actually went to Lebanon. I had a very different experience. And then the next instance was when the first Gulf War happened. I remember I was traveling to soccer practice, and it was all on the radio, and my dad was, this is a just war, and we're doing the right thing, and I wasn't sure. And then, 9/11 happened, and that was the next big moment, and I kept thinking to myself, I don't know how to react. I wanted to be a pacifist. I said, I'm a pacifist, except when it's just not to be. And then that's when I started to realize I wanted to think more about these issues. And as I did my PhD, I was trained as a political theorist who was interested in the history of political thought, and I was interested in encounters between Europe and the so-called New World. And if you read about that and learn about that, you automatically have to think about just war, because that was the concept. Are the Spanish waging a just war against the quote-unquote barbarians? And that's how I became interested in the subject. And now I would say I'm less interested in the historical aspect, although the historical aspect certainly informed my thinking. And I'm currently working on sort of questions of drone technology, the ethics, and with the rise of groups like ISIS, who the U.S. has labeled as barbarians, that takes me back to my original initial research about what does it mean to wage a just war against barbarians.
Is it possible to win a moral victory in contemporary warfare?
I would hope so. But again, I think, at least in the kind of research I'm doing, sort of drone warfare against so-called terrorist groups or just war against barbarians, if you go back and look at these in the context of, sort of the just war tradition, victory is the annihilation of the other, and I don't know in the current context if we could ever, one, justify a war of annihilation and what that would even look like. I guess you would call it genocide today, and whether that's what we really want to be shooting for. So I think of, rather than talking about moral victories, about reframing the context in which we talk about conflict and talk about our enemies as a beginning to think about how we could formulate victory, because we can't win a war of annihilation against the other, against the barbarian, but maybe we could obtain some kind of victory which is built on reconciliation and reintegration of the quote-unquote enemy.
Do you think that if the end goal is something more like reconciliation than annihilation, is the contemporary trend towards operations other than war or low-intensity conflict, small skirmishes, is that kind of use of violent force conducive to reconciliation? Or just part of the necessary
I don't think
process?
so, actually. I think it's more conducive towards a sense of perpetual low-intensity conflict, and the idea that we can't win a grand victory, but we'll avoid a broad defeat, or maybe be able to reconceptualize the way we think about security. As long as we're safe at home, it doesn't matter what happens far away. In the U.S., we say we're in a war on terror, a war against Al-Qaeda, and there's no understanding of when that could possibly end. Will it be 2-3 generations? Will my children be at war with Al-Qaeda? But yet, that seems far away in the distance, and I think the idea of limited force, the use of drones, is insulating us in many ways from that conflict, but also from what goes on the ground there in terms of the people who have to live under what I call an aerial drone occupation.
Okay, and the last question then, you mentioned the idea of a broad defeat. Can a nation-state or a modern state suffer a broad defeat at the hands of an asymmetric actor?
I think you can be destabilized, and if you unpack the term destabilized, there's certain economic effects. There's a psychological effect on the way you think about your personal liberties. I think it can destabilize a society in the way it views its population and the diversity within it. So, for example, in the U.S., the current struggle against ISIS has raised questions about a fifth column somehow living within the United States, and I think that that's going to have a very disturbing impact on the way policing is undertaken. We've already seen it in terms of race relations in the U.S., but I think it's going to get worse, unfortunately, unless we really come to terms with what values we're going to uphold in terms of liberty, tolerance, and equality, and what we as a state are willing to tolerate. But that becomes problematic in a context, going back to the theme of barbarians, when we're supposedly waging a war against barbarians in which we can't in any way engage with them. And I think that's why the term is problematic.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us today.